And welcome back to the trial of the nurse Lucy Letby. In this video I'm going to be covering for you the closing speech given by Nicholas Johnson KC on behalf of the prosecution. Mr. Johnson is addressing the jury. Mr. Johnson is explaining how he will approach his closing speech. He says what we want to do is point out similarities of the cases and point out the evolution of Lucy Letby's murderous assaults on these children and point out how calculating and devious she has been. Mr. Johnson says Letby picked Mr. Mansuti, a plumber, as a defence witness to pick on incidents which aren't actually relevant to the case. He says there may have been one occasion when there was a backed up sink in neonatal room 1, but it did not correlate with any of the incidents heard. If it had, someone would have noted it. His evidence isn't going to help you decide in this case. He was called, we suggest, to bolster the tattered credibility of Lucy Letby. And you might ask yourself, why? Mr. Johnson says child P's injuries, combined with the insulin poisonings, had nothing to do with the plumbing. Please do not be distracted. Letby got away with her campaign of violence for so long as it was not contemplated that a nurse could do such acts. Mr. Johnson says the similarities in these cases shows who this person was. Lucy Letby had used ways of killing babies that didn't leave much of a trace. Her behaviour persuaded many of her colleagues that most of the collapses were normal. They couldn't see the wood through the trees. No one was contemplating the possibility of foul play. Mr. Johnson says Dr. Breary said, in relation to confirmation bias, that senior nursing staff didn't believe this could be true, but the year was spent with increasing suspicion with each incident. None of us wanted to believe it either. Then we stopped to take a step back to think about it. The unexpected collapses, the unusual rash on a number of occasions, the association with Lucy Letby. Each time it became more statistically improbable. Mr. Johnson says Dr. Breary didn't know about the liver injury or the insulin poisonings at that time. Dr. Ravi Jairam had said it was an unprecedented situation. Quote, "It seems utterly preposterous. Then more and more happens. It seems easy to see things which aren't there. We are taught to think about common things, less common things, rare things. We do not generally consider unnatural causes or deliberate acts." Mr. Johnson refers to the Gang of Four conspiracy theory. He says in Letby's defence statement there is a suggestion that the collapses and deaths were a product of staff shortages, mistakes, or insufficiently qualified staff. Mr. Johnson says Letby said that was a medical opinion, but the jury have not had any medical opinion to back that up. The only things that matter is to concentrate on the issues in this case. Concentrate on the 17 children in this case and see if there are any shortcomings. Mr. Johnson says for child A, Letby said there were issues with the long line and if we agree it was an air embolus that Melanie Taylor was to blame. Mr. Johnson says child A did not die of dehydration and it was not Melanie Taylor who supplied the air embolus. For child B, there was nothing. For child C, there was nothing. For child D, Letby said there was a delay in antibiotics, but child D did not die from an infection. For child E, it was delay in response to the bleeding. Mr. Johnson asks, where did the bleeding come from in the first place? For child F, there was nothing. For child G, initial blame with a colleague, but Letby then went back on that. For child H, some of the drains were not securely put in, and potential incompetence. Mr. Johnson says Letby uses the word potential a lot. For child I, nothing on event 1 or 3. For event 2, Ashley Hudson was blamed for not full monitoring after child I was taken off antibiotics within 48 hours. But child I had been off antibiotics for much longer. In the fourth event, potential medical staff issues with doctors being absent may have contributed. For child J, nothing. For child K, there was nothing. For child L, there was nothing. For child M, the unit was very stretched and child M was not in a proper bed. For child N, the unit was very busy, but child N was due to go home. For child O, there was nothing. For child P, concern overnight for child P's condition, but there was no medical record of this. For child Q, there was nothing. Mr. Johnson adds, do you really think the Gang of Four would say things to get Lucy Letby convicted? He says, what did the doctors say that wasn't true? Mr. Johnson says the Gang of Four didn't do a very good job of scapegoating Lucy Letby, as they missed the insulin evidence, the best piece of evidence of all. He says all the clues point in one direction, don't they? She's sitting in the back of the court. He says the Four didn't even know about the wildly out of kilter insulin readings when they blew the whistle. Mr. Johnson says Letby was an opportunist who targeted ill babies. He said she tried to use their vulnerabilities as a camouflage for her actions. He says she probably would have got away with it had she stopped after some of the earlier children in this case. But in the case of the babies poisoned with insulin, she showed her ignorance of how synthetic insulin works and the biological footprint it leaves. Mr. Johnson says when she thought she was rumbled in June 2016, she did her best to create the impression the neonatal unit was dysfunctional by putting in false datic sheets. Lucy Letby, we say, put a lot of effort in trying to pull the wool over your eyes. He says Letby spent a lot of time talking about being isolated from her friends. He refers to the note, quote, I am evil, I did this. He says we'll come back to that at the end. There are more important things in this case. He says it was established Lucy Letby was not isolated and was still in contact with people she had not been allowed to contact. And even though she knew that we had her phone, she repeated that lie. We went to the spreadsheet and the lie was exposed, wasn't it? She thought that if she said something often enough, it would be accepted. We suggest that Lucy Letby was an opportunist. She used vulnerabilities as a camouflage. He says the misperception of the vulnerabilities gave her away. He says Letby thought child A and child B had an inherited blood disorder, and that allowed her the cover to target them. If she had left it there, she probably would have got away with it. Her ignorance of insulin C-peptide and the ratio to insulin allowed her to poison child E and child L. What she didn't know about was the disconnection between the insulin and the insulin C-peptide ratio. This leaves a biological footprint, which leaves foul play. She would have got away with that if police hadn't referred the cases to Dr. Evans. He says Letby returned from a holiday in June 2016 and embarked on a killing spree, with child O and child P killed and attempting to murder child Q. He says Letby put in false data sheets to cover her tracks and first put in the theory of an air embolus on June 30th, 2016. Mr. Johnson says he will look at 5 cases in one go: twins child E and F, twins child L and M, and child K. He says for child E and F and L and M, one twin was poisoned with insulin and the other deliberately administered air. The cases were months apart. What are the chances of that? He says Letby invented other cases of problems where none existed. With child K, it was that she was a serial tube dislodger, but child K had been sedated. For the 2 poisoned with insulin, they were deliberately targeted. Mr. Johnson refers to child E and child F's mother's evidence, given several months ago, for events from July 30th, 2015. Mr. Johnson says the mother was a very, very important witness. He says the evidence was that providing milk was a big priority for her twins, as it was the only thing she could do. Child E was crying like nothing she had ever heard before. It was horrendous, more of a scream than a cry. Mr. Johnson says screaming was also recorded for child I and child N. Mr. Johnson says the mother described child E's blood around the mouth like a goatee beard. Letby had said the blood came from the NG tube and the registrar was on his way. Letby told the mother to go back to the postnatal ward and had done so by 9:11 p.m. This is a head-on credibility contest between the mother and Lucy Letby. You can be sure Lucy Letby is lying on this, plainly as any parent will understand. Provision of milk and food to any newborn infant is important, and 2100 was child E's feeding time. The mother testified, crying like nothing I'd heard before. It was a sound which shouldn't have come from a tiny baby. It was horrendous. You may think the mother would have a very good reason to remember this. Either she saw blood, or she didn't. Why would she make it up? If she did see blood at 2100, then Letby's nursing notes are false. Dr. Sandy Bowen says the NG tube for child E had been in place from July 29th to August 3rd, 2015. Mr. Johnson says that was never disputed. He asks why the tube was the cause of the bleed, as said by Letby. Letby had panicked. It was a panicked reaction told to a mother who knew no better, and it was designated to cover her tracks. Mr. Johnson refers to the quote, 1 mil bleed Letby recorded for child N. Letby, interviewed on that, had said the tube insertion can cause a bleed, just a small amount. Mr. Johnson says the mother of child E recorded a small amount of blood at 9 p.m. He says if that was the case, then child E was producing lots of blood by 10 p.m. He says Letby falsified nursing notes for child E. He tells the jury they can be sure the mother was telling the truth, as the mother rang her husband, and the phone call record proves that at 9:11 p.m. This was a call lasting over 4 minutes. He says the father's evidence backs up the mother's evidence on the content of the phone call. Have the parents made that up to get at Lucy Letby? Are they in on it? Are they a sub-gang of two? Mr. Johnson says, of all the things to see in your life, you would remember seeing your son in terminal decline, as the mother recalled returning later to see efforts to save child E's life. He says if the parents are telling the truth, then Letby's account is a lie. He says there is a fundamental difference between the mother's compelling account and Letby's lie in the notes. Dr. David Harkness's note for 11 p.m, Mr. Johnson says, coincides with the telephone call from the midwife at 10:52 p.m. to the father of child E in a call which lasts over 14 minutes. Letby's family communication note records, quote, both parents present during the resus. Mr. Johnson says the pieces of the jigsaw fit only one way, and the parents' recollection is at odds with Letby's. Mr. Johnson says the prosecution say Letby attacked child E and was interrupted first time, then attacked again. He says of the mother's account, it's powerful evidence, independent of the medical evidence, that Lucy Letby murdered child E. Mr. Johnson says Dr. David Harkness in evidence gave a chronological sequence of what happened. He says he accepted he had been on the neonatal unit from 9:30 p.m. A fluid balance chart for child E is shown to the court. Quote, 15 ml fresh blood is written in the 10 p.m. column, accepted it was written in Letby's handwriting. Mr. Johnson says it was signed by Belinda Simcock. This was done deliberately so Letby could disassociate herself on the paperwork from the incident. Mr. Johnson refers to the case of child I, where Letby altered the timing for her designated baby that was due to be transferred to Stoke. Mr. Johnson says Letby needed an innocent reason for why child E's 9 p.m. feed was omitted, and does so by suggesting Dr. David Harkness was on the unit earlier in the shift. Dr. Harkness had suspected a gastrointestinal bleed for child E, but all the observations were good and did not point to that. None of these doctors suspected sabotage. They all looked for a natural cause. This was not, however, a level playing field. There was no natural cause. Dr. Harkness had said something had been interfering with child E's oxygen flow into the bloodstream. A strange pattern over the tummy area which didn't fit with the poor perfusion. There were these strange kind of purple patches. There were patches in one area, then in another. It was unusual for a baby in child E's condition. Dr. David Harkness had said he had not seen these patches, no smaller than 1 to 2 centimetres, which didn't remain constant outside of the babies in this case, child A and child E. Dr. Harkness had said, quote, "It was something that was so unusual, it's hard to give a clear description." Dr. Harkness was traumatised by what he had seen, in the way child E had bled, in the way he did. He said Letby, by comparison, on the day child E died, texted, quote, "One of those things, nothing to see here." He says Letby was gaslighting her colleagues. Mr. Johnson says Dr. Harkness was not one of the Gang of Four. He says one of Dr. Harkness's colleagues, also a doctor, recalled Dr. Harkness was animated when describing the discoloration. He says if Dr. Harkness is lying, then the doctor colleague is also lying. How deep does this conspiracy go? He says Letby had described, quote, "strange discoloration on child E, with red horizontal banding around the stomach." Mr. Johnson says if Letby agrees there was discoloration on child E, why was Dr. Harkness taken to task for describing it in cross-examination? He suggests it was an attack on Dr. Harkness. A medical expert had excluded the possibility of a congenital blood disorder. Dr. Evans said stress for child E had been ruled out, and the graphic skin discoloration provided by Dr. Harkness was clear evidence of air administered into child E's system. Mr. Johnson says there is only one person who could have been responsible for administering air into child E. He says for the bleed, this was no naturally occurring bleed. Dr. Sandy Bowen said child E had been incredibly stable prior to the deteriorations. The 16mm aspirate at 9 p.m. struck her as really odd in that context. She was at a loss to explain where this had come from. Mr. Johnson says this discrepancy is also seen in child N and child G, and the similarities are all down to Lucy Letby's behaviour. He adds, pointing to Letby in the doc. Dr. Bowen had agreed with Dr. Evans to say air had been injected. The hemorrhage seen by babies such as child E on this scale was vanishingly rare. The purple patches, Dr. Bowen said, didn't fit with any explanation other than air embolus. Dr. Bowen rejected a suggestion that stress in child E caused excess stomach acid which caused the bleeding, Mr. Johnson adds. Mr. Johnson says child E declined within about an hour of Letby coming on duty that night. What are the chances of that? Mr. Johnson says the point of circumstantial evidence is pointing at the threads of evidence and the collapses always happening when Letby is in the neonatal unit. He adds, there are no innocent reasons for child E's collapse and death. Nicholas Johnson tells the court the level of insulin in child L was double that found in child F several months later. That tells you a lot about intention, doesn't it? He says for child A, Letby was interviewed about this and said in the aftermath she had asked for the dextrose bag to be kept in June 2015. It was put in a sluice room and a colleague had confirmed this was done. He says that Letby knew no one subsequently examined the bag. He says Letby taunted the police by repeatedly asking the question if police had the bag which had insulin in. She thought the fact that they didn't have the bag would give her a free pass, but she was wrong, because what she didn't know was insulin C-peptide. Mr. Johnson says experts had given evidence from the laboratory to show results indicating insulin and insulin C-peptide levels from there were reliable, and Letby had accepted this in evidence. Mr. Johnson said it was ruled out that insulin could have been applied to the nutrition bag in the pharmacy prior to its arrival on the ward. Evidence had been heard by one of the pharmacy team to this effect, and it was not challenged. Mr. Johnson says the murderer had to have been working both night shifts for child F and child L. Only 3 people were working both shifts. One was a nursery nurse and would not have been in room 1. Another was Belinda Simcock, and the third was Lucy Letby, who hung up the bag for child F. Child L got more than one poisoned bag of insulin. These are not random poisonings. He says it's obvious who is responsible, as there is only one person who could be responsible. Mr. Johnson shows to the court a tiny vial of insulin, which had been added by someone who had access to the nutrition bags in the fridge, of which there were a limited number of candidates. Mr. Johnson says we have heard from all of them, and there is only one candidate left. Mr. Johnson says it does not need to be found how it was done, as the evidence shows it was done. Anyone, if they wanted to, could inject 0.6 ml of insulin into that bag. A tiny amount of insulin could have fatal consequences. What is the state of mind of someone who does that? Is it someone who watches someone freshly born desaturating for up to half a minute in the case of child K? Is it a sick person? This was a targeted attack. Mr. Johnson says we know from evidence that insulin is never put into a TPN bag. The case of child F had been referred to medical experts as the events for child E were, quote, suspicious. He says the first contaminated bag was put up for child F at 12:25 a.m. Child F vomited less than an hour later. A medical expert said this was a symptom of low blood sugar as a self-defense mechanism for the body. There was also a sudden rise in the heart rate as the body produced adrenaline to combat it. The blood sugar level of 0.8 was a life-threatening situation for child F. No other child on the unit was receiving TPN bags that day, in the case of child F. The turnover of TPN bags was very low, according to evidence by Yvonne Griffiths. The bag was only ever going to one child, wasn't it? It's so sly, isn't it? Mr. Johnson says the insulin-contaminated bag was going to be administered when the poisoner was not on duty, to be administered by an unsuspecting colleague, a member of her family, as she put it. What does that tell you about the mindset? It shows you a cynical, cold-blooded planner, Mr. Johnson says. The amount of insulin in the 2 bags was about the same, which showed there had been thought put into the preparation. Mr. Johnson says Letby told some interesting lies about child F in police interview. She claimed she hadn't been aware of any concerns about child F's blood sugar. He says Letby otherwise had a very good memory. You know she is lying from the text messages she sent to a nursing colleague. Police broke the news of insulin C-peptide to Letby in November of 2020. The constant searching of child E and F's mother on Facebook was never properly explained. Mr. Johnson says Letby was cold, calculated, cruel and relentless.